I can
Good
see you okay.
afternoon. This is Noman Azmi. We are now going to be having a discussion on South Asian languages spoken in the UK and the risk of these languages being lost within the next generation. And also we'll be looking at what can we do to preserve this. But we're also going to be looking at some of the activities, projects that's been running within the South Asian languages. And I'm delighted to tell you that we now have two distinguished guests. We have Wajid Yassin, who is the founder of Modas Arts, but he's also a sound artist. And he has been working on a fantastic, exciting project called the Tape Letters. And I will let Wajid explain a little bit about it in a minute. And the other guest we have is Dr. Taslim Shakur, who is a retired professor and currently editor-in-chief of the International Editorial Board of the journal called South Asian Cultural Studies. So welcome, both of you. And it's very nice to have you both on our panel today. So if I can ask Wajid, first of all, to give a bit more elaborate introduction of yourself and talk a little bit about the Tape Letters, please.
Okay, so my name is Wajid Yassin. I'm a Manchester-born, London-based sound artist. I sort of used to be a music producer about 20 years ago, and I shifted my practice into sonic arts. I did my sort of MA in sonic arts, my PhD in sonic arts as a discipline about 10 years ago, and I set up Modas Arts as a way of essentially facilitating sonic arts as a sort of a line of inquiry. I've been working for the last 3 years on an oral history project. And this oral history project looks at the use of cassette tapes as a sort of an unusual form of long distance communication that was used by people like my parents who came from Pakistan in the 60s and the 70s. Actually, the use was right up until the 80s and 90s. Some people sort of used it right until the 90s itself. But essentially, the use of cassette tapes as a mode of comms, and it had various reasons as to why that was used as a mode of comms rather than sort of letter writing or phone calls. And the project has it's been running for about 3 years. We did a pilot project a couple of years ago, and we've sort of just on the verge of finishing our 2-year project, and we're looking to start work on the third iteration. But by managing to find these cassette tapes and sort of undertaking oral history interviews with the people that recorded these messages, we've uncovered all sorts of extraordinary stories around migration, around the kind of maybe not the misuse, but the interpretive use of technology, but really also around language and some of the kind of interesting aspects of an oral only language, which was the one that was used on these cassettes predominantly, and it's a language called Potwari. So we've been looking into the nature of oral-only languages and the kind of inadvertent preservation of these languages on the cassette tapes. That's where we are.
Right. Thank you, Wajid. We'll come back to you for your presentation shortly. Dr. Shakur, if you can just elaborate a little bit more about your area of work.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Wajid for this fascinating start of a project and the background, which I'll be really looking forward to hear more about it, particularly the oral history and this exchange with cassette tapes as well, which is very much my era time as well. As far as I'm concerned, I am a retired academic, but which has got wears a hat. I wear different kind of hats of sociology and anthropological studies. But one of my main interests was in South Asian cultural studies, and I did a bit of work on the language maintenance and shift. And the last one I did was on the South Asian culture in non-English, which we try to look into reconstructing popular culture. So we looked into 2-3 years ago all the cultures of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, how they're representing in their own languages, which unfortunately were marred with the European Englishes or European cultures. And therefore, we were not getting the essence of it. I mean, before this, I did a book on imagining South Asian culture in English. And I found there was a big difference between the way identity are being portrayed in South Asian Englishes. I start from the Rudyard Kipling's time to all kind of midnight children. On the other hand, if they read literature in Bengali, Urdu, Hindi, right from the 1930s, sort of progressive writers associations in Europe, these give a very different understanding. For example, those of you who have seen Satyajit Ray's film, one of the first Urdu Hindi films called Shatranj Ki Khilari, which is like the chess player, which talks about the end of the Mughal Empire in South Asia, which is wonderfully kept in his film. But it is actually by Prem Chand, who is a Hindi writer in the 1920s. So we try to revive those things to see his currency now and to see how does it differ in politically and in methodological as well in morphological way, which we thought was a great understanding. And it is interesting that people like Wajid and others are now bringing back the local cultures. But we just have to make sure that so that it is not it is sort of the baby is not drawn by the bath water, so that the language of the old spirit is kept rather than just having numerical 550 language or dialects has been done in documenting that. I will be more interested in the political representation of these cultures. So I'll stop here.
Right. So I think it's we start with your presentation about the tape letters, Wajid. If you want to start sharing your screen, and so we can start that presentation, please.
Sure. Let me just load this thing up, and obviously just let me know if this is something that you can see. Now, can you see that fine?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
I'll leave it in this view. I know that kind of within PowerPoint you can have a kind of full presentation view, but it's actually quite useful for me to have these little panels on the left hand side, just so I can see what's coming up. Now, what I don't want to do is to do a full talk around tape letters, because that will take like an hour and a little bit, and I don't want to take over kind of the full the full amount of allotted time for this thing, because I'm very keen on actually hearing Dr. Shakur's take on this thing. So what I'll do is I'll skip through many of these slides. Okay. What I'll do, I'll just show some that are kind of, I think, that are relevant to what we're talking about today. So we'll skip through all of it, through bits of it. But it just gives you a bit of an idea in terms of what essentially the project is about. It's looking at these things. Okay. And just to give you a very quick sort of background, this is just some of the kind of work I do as a music producer, the various sort of projects I'm involved in over the years. I'll skip through all of this, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of, a bit of a visual idea of the kind of work that I'm involved in. Right? I'll give you a very brief introduction to the project. It really came about from about 5 years ago, when I was trying to find some information around this particular cassette. This belonged to my dad. This is my father, who died about 20 years ago. And when he first came over to the UK in the 60s and 70s, he used to record these devotional hymns called the Nat. He used to record these Nats on cassette tapes, and he would distribute these cassette tapes to the various to various members of the community in Manchester, which is where he was living. And the reason why was that when I was a little boy, I remember kind of people coming over to our home, listening to him sing. They would invite him to their homes and get him to sing there, in mosques or in various other places. And it just was a convenient way for other members of the community to listen to him singing. They'd be like, listen, we can listen to your Nats on a cassette tape. It's convenient. We can do it anytime we like, instead of you having to come around all the time, right? I was looking for one of these, and what I found alongside one of these Nat tapes, I also found these tapes. And this was in my mom's home in Manchester. And that in Urdu says, Tudi se grelon bate. Right? That's the chatterings of the Tudi village. And I knew that these weren't Nat tapes, they were something else. And in fact, of course, I was immediately transported to when I was a little boy, being pulled in by my mom and dad saying, say Salam Dar to some auntie or uncle in Pakistan, right? So I knew actually that I had something fairly significant in my hands as a snapshot of time. Actually, that was my strongest feeling when I first stumbled on these things, that these are an interesting snapshot of time. What I didn't realize is how that time was filled, what that time actually was. And in fact, what we've subsequently found out is that time was filled with language and migratory experiences and experiences like partition. All these stories around identity are actually wrapped up and tied in these cassette tapes, which I didn't understand when I first stumbled on these things, right? So we undertook a project. I'll sort of, I'll not go into these into great detail, but we were keen to have one centralized archive of these cassette tapes. And we were sort of keen to look at intergenerational discourse around identities. We wanted to contextualize the use of the tapes as a parallel form of communication, alongside letter writing and the occasional phone call. And we wanted to make sure that whatever we found was relayed back to the community in their language. That was very important for us, to not say that it was going to be relayed in Urdu and not in English, because the people that used this method spoke Patwari, and something like about 75% of the British Pakistani community identify from a specific region, the Patwar region. And so we wanted to make sure this was relayed in their language, right? And of course, we all know that language and class are synonymous, right? So there's definitely a class dynamic about choosing to use Patwari over Urdu, right? And this is what we managed to do. This we managed to basically create a centralized archive. We have the archive that's held at the Bishopsgate Institute. At that time, as part of the pilot project, we managed to grab a hold of 22 cassettes and did 34 oral histories. We'd put on exhibitions, and all sorts of interesting ways of public engagement with these things. So this is some of the kind of testimonies that we found around this stuff. This is my mum, and her experience of this stuff, of using these cassette tapes, is actually quite a common one, which is that she, as the daughter of working class farmers in Pakistan, didn't have access to education. So it's a very different life to us as males and educated guys. And it's part of the kind of gender discrimination that she experienced, that women of her generation and of her socio-economic class experienced, which is basically no education. And I'm talking about not going to primary school, right? And what it meant was that she was unable to access language, which meant she couldn't read or write at all. And still to this day doesn't speak, can't read, she barely read or write, Urdu. She can read Arabic because she's a Muslim, and she sort of reads the Quran. Obviously doesn't understand it, and she barely speaks English to this day. So her understanding of language is really interesting because it's tied entirely to her ability to be able to speak it, not read it or write it, right? And so with her, what happened is that she came to the UK about 7 years after my father arrived in the 60s, which was a common experience. The men came over here. They were expected to be here for about 3 years after the kind of call out was made, to help rebuild the UK after the Second World War. And they were expected to return after about 3 or 4 years, right? And what happened is that they didn't. They established themselves, they established work, they found themselves a better life, and then their partners were brought over 7 years later or so, right? But she was maltreated by her in-laws. And in fact, what happened is, in this particular instance, her in-laws carried on with that ill treatment when she came to the UK. So they'd send her a letter with all of this horrible stuff, right? Attacking her directly. So she responded with a tape. She couldn't read or write. She went, I'll show them something, right? And recorded this tape, gave it to a relative of mine who was meant to be paying a visit to Pakistan.
Wajid, can I just interrupt you 1 second?
Certainly.
Just wondering, when you said she was maltreated, was it more like a emotional blackmail they were doing with her?
Yes, and also gaslighting. They were basically gaslighting her. They were basically sort of, all of the accusations that she made against them. They were saying, "No, we haven't actually said this at all." And essentially, they'd been just stealing money from her left, right, and centre that my father had been sending to her, right? And just essentially just piled abuse on her. And of course, she hasn't even relayed all of that to me. She's given me
And that
some
was
idea
taking
about-
place between Pakistan and England.
That's right.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you. Carry on.
And so what happened is that she responded instead of letter form. She recorded a message on cassette tape and have it actually vetted. She checked in with my father as to whether this was kind of appropriate and okay, right? But she was very stern in her defense of herself, and the cassette tape allowed her to do that. So she gave it to a relative. The story is he actually found out what was on it and brought it back. He was like, "This is going to cause a shitstorm." Okay, we can't pass this over. We know this is going to cause damage. He brought it back, and she was furious, absolutely furious. So she sent it in the post to make sure they got it, and of course the shitstorm happened, right? But it tells you that the cassette tape itself became an extraordinary, vital lifeline for people like her. This is not just like, "Oh, isn't the weather cold here?" This isn't just a kind of a domestic, or like, how we're dealing with the snow here, or whatever, or it's or the food is odd and the people, whatever. There's something else going on with these cassette tapes. They facilitated another kind of interpersonal discourse, right?
Are you happy to share a sample of what she was suggesting there?
No. We'll leave that. We'll leave it. Yeah. Because if we go back, there's a million and one stories that, in fact, if I tell you that, then there's plenty other things that you're not going to find out about.
Okay.
I think the key thing to understand why is it called tape letters is those people who migrated in the 60s, 70s, or even 80s, because they were unable to read and write in their own language, they couldn't write letters. So for them to be able to communicate with their loved ones and share their feelings about their life in this country or know about them, they communicated between each other through tapes rather than letters. Hence, these are called tape letters. Am I correct in that conclusion?
Yes, you are. Yeah, it's exactly right. And in fact, it's what I'm trying to make is that the cassette tapes themselves, they were developed in the 1960s, 1963, by a company called Philips. It's a Dutch company. Essentially, cassette tapes were a music media. That's what it was. It was essentially a micro version of a reel-to-reel, a quarter-inch reel-to-reel tapes. And in fact, a lot of Pakistanis who use this still call cassettes reelan. They're still called reels.
Can I ask you a question? What I want to know, Wajid, is the dimension of language that you found through your work with the tape letters, through your research, because I know you have worked with some specialist linguists who worked on the Patwari language, which, to be honest, I was quite surprised when I heard that about nearly 3/4 of Pakistanis in this country speak Patwari, and yet I had no idea until a year ago.
Yeah.
So, and I understand that your tape letters project has a significant emphasis on this Patwari language, and you had a Patwari heritage linguist who I'm, to be honest, that linguist would have been in our panel today, but for personal circumstances, she couldn't do it today. But I would like you to elaborate on that particular angle on the language diversity and in relation to particularly Patwari, because yesterday we were talking about it and you were mentioning about the different dimension of language within the language. So can you just elaborate on that, please?
Certainly. So let me show you. These are some photographs that I took when I was on the Pakistani side of Kashmir. So obviously Kashmir, like Punjab, has been separated because of sort of complex, historical realities, right? And this is an area called Gujar Khan. So this is kind of like that's in the Patwar region, and there's the majority of like people are from the Patwar region. So Gujar Khan is kind of one of them, right? And so the problem that we had was that given that there was an oral only language, how do we make something like that accessible? So we know that the Punjabi is is obviously split between the Indian side of Punjab and the Pakistani side of Punjab. And on the Indian side of Punjab, it's known as Gurumukhi, right? And it has the Gurumukhi sort of script, right?
Yes.
And of course, we know that on the Pakistani side, it's called Shahmukhi, right? And so we have Punjabi, which is essentially a heavily borrowed version of Urdu, which with some slight variations, but it's also known as Shahmukhi. So you have Punjabi written in essentially the Urdu form. So Punjabi is written as Punjabi using sort of Urdu script, and it's known as Shahmukhi, right? So we have these two different sort of ways of scripting the same language that's spoken. The interesting thing for when I was growing up was we were told that we speak Punjabi, right? But I couldn't really understand why there were differences, regional differences in Punjabi. I never understood why Sikhs Punjabi, that was considered to be pure Punjabi, right? For us, at least. And even Lahori Punjabi, which is close to the border, why that was considered to be like a better version of Punjabi. I've since found out, actually, we don't speak Punjabi at all. We speak Patwari. In fact, the interesting thing is that most people even don't even know that we speak Patwari as an actual language. And it's not even a dialect of Punjabi. It's what's known as a transitional language. And so we've been looking into social linguists' work. Lothers and Lothers did an extraordinary kind of research on that, where they embedded themselves in Gujar Khan for 4 years. These guys are linguists, much like Farah Nazir, Dr. Farah Nazir is. And these guys have uncovered that Patwari is what's known as a transitional language. So it exists between Punjabi and another language called Hindko. It's somewhere in between. And that
what I was telling you yesterday, Noman, Hinko.
Yeah, I remember.
Right. And so even though it has no written form, it still doesn't take it away from it being defined as a language. Now, I'm not a linguist, so I don't really know where the definition really is between a language and a dialect, but these guys have deemed it to be a language. And in fact, if you go on to Ethnologue, who also categorize all the stuff, they also include it as a language, right? So it's a oral only, non-written language, Patwari. And I didn't even know I spoke it, and that's what we speak, right? So that's a remarkable thing to sort of to find that out, for one thing.
I mean, what I find it fascinating about this whole Tape project is the way those linguistic heritage has been kept. Because, I mean, one of the things that I was looking at when I was researching about the diverse languages spoken within the South Asian community. Yeah. And we know that South Asia consists of 8 countries, right? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But and we also know that there is a very small Bhutanese and Maldivian community in Britain. Although the language they speak, for instance, Bhutan, the language is called Zonka. Okay. I have never heard that being spoken, but I am interested to probably go online and listen to how that sounds.
Yeah.
Maldives, their language is called Divehi. Divehi is the language that they speak. But these 2 countries are very small in terms of population size, and they have a very small British South Asia, Maldivian or Bhutanese community. But there is a sizable Nepalese and other communities. So, for instance, Nepalese community speaks their language is Nepali. Bangladesh, which is got the 3rd largest South Asian community in the UK, has only one language, predominantly Bangla, because that's the language of probably around 90% of the population. But what is interesting is these other countries. I mean, Sri Lanka also has 2 main languages, which is Sinhala and Tamil, because we know that Tamil is a language that's shared with India because there is a Tamil community in India. But the India and Pakistan is what I find the most fascination about. I'm fascinated because we all know that Urdu is the national language of Pakistan. But what we do not know is only 8% of the population of Pakistan speaks it as their first language.
Exactly.
So the majority of the population, about 39% of the population, speaks Punjabi as their first language. And then you have 18% speaks Pashtu as their first language. Yeah. Then you have Saraki. I mean, I never even heard of this language, Saraki, until I started researching about it. 12% of the population speaks Saraki, and then 3% speaks Baluchi. Then there's other languages like Brohi, Kashmiri. then 15% speak Sindhi. So
Yep.
when you look at all those diversity of languages within a community, so when you talk about Pakistani community in Britain, as we have mentioned earlier, the Patwari is the dominant language, but there's Punjabi, and as you mentioned, Wajid, the shift between the Punjabi and the Patwari, and Urdu became the common language for the South Asian, whether you are from Bangladesh or India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, or even South Africa, East Africa, whatever. Urdu has become the link language for all South Asians. But if you go to India, it's even more mind-boggling. We have the national language Hindi, but yes, the majority does speak Hindi, but you have sizable community who speaks Urdu, Bangla. In the whole world, West Bengal speaks Bangla, and then you have Tamil, Gujarati, Punjabi. Then you have Telugu, Marathi, Malayalam, Kanara, Assamese, Maithili, Oriya, which is probably the language of Orisha. Then you have Santali. And what is interesting to see is that there are some languages spoken in India that are spoken in other parts. So for instance, Bengali is speaking in India as well as Bangladesh. Nepali is also spoken in India, but in Nepal, you have Sindhi and Kashmiri and Urdu and Punjabi speaking in India as well as Pakistan. So there's these dimensions of cross-border language commonality that brings another dimension. So when you come to British South Asian community, the language spoken within these communities are quite vast. But when you deep into it, and these minority languages, for instance, the Patwari, although it's majority in the population, but as a language in Pakistan is a minority. And then you talk about the Brohi or the Baluchis. That's when you start to realize that are we really at risk of losing this linguistic heritage within the future generations of this country? Now, I would like to ask Dr. Shakur, what is your take on as to the reason why these languages are not being practiced in the second, third, or even the fourth generation South Asians in the manner that, for instance, I'm a first generation. I came here as an adult. I'm assuming, Dr. Shakur, so are you, but Wajid is born and bred in this country. So people like ourselves who come to this country as an adult, have children, then our children and their children, how do we preserve those languages? First question is, are we preserving it? And that's the first question. And then if not, how can we do it? So Dr. Shakur, please.
No, if you don't mind, I'm still want to get on with Wajid's presentation, if you may, for maybe another 5 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you look into that map you're just showing? I find it's quite fascinating. The map you're showing, although there's no key, I just wanted to know those green and the purple areas. So if you quickly finish your presentation, then we can get into a real hold of it. And we
well, I sort of mentioned
just
that.
Give the highlight one, okay? So
Well, I sort of mentioned that I didn't want to. I'm not doing anywhere near the sort of full presentation of this thing because, like I say, I think it would take up too much of my time. And I'm more curious about your response to the question that Numan has just asked than I am about talking about my thing, because I know it too well, and I'm curious about you guys more than anything, to be honest.
No, because your presentation might give some clue to the response I'm going to make. Because
okay, well, the interesting thing is that my Patwari is terrible. Like, actually, it's really broken. It's obviously, given that it's an oral only thing, so this is only transferred orally. Right, so there's no kind of obvious way of sharing this information. The only way of sharing the language is just exposure, right? And as soon as you're outside of that exposure, it dies. So my son, for example, his second language isn't Urdu, Patwari, Punjabi, any South Asian languages whatsoever. It's Swedish. My partner is Swedish, and that's what he taught. That's what he speaks, right? Which means his relationship to my mother is extraordinarily limited. And in fact, my mother doesn't really know me properly because Patwari isn't my first language and English isn't hers. So there's a limit to what we can share between ourselves, right? And this is just, I am the product of migration. We're all speaking in English. This is what happens. And the fact that, had my mom migrated to Canada, Isaac's second language would be French, right? It wouldn't be again, it wouldn't be Punjabi or Patwari, right?
Absolutely.
So this is just a product of kind of migration, and I think inevitably languages are going to die. So the question is, how do we get to some level of orality? If someone like me, even someone like me who was born in the 50 years ago and exposed to that kind of orality, is still not particularly fluent in the thing. So the only way that we thought is essentially to transliterate using Urdu, right? So we essentially get something like this where we do an interview, it's time coded, and I would be saying, in this interview, that from right to left, that says Beli cheez hai to sana na kehve, right? And he says Mara naam Muhammad Zareen. Now, if it was in Urdu, it would be like Hamara naam Muhammad Zareen hai or something, right? But it says Mara naam Muhammad Zareen hai, right? And you can see here this is a transliterated version in English. Beli cheez hai to sana na kehve, Mara naam Muhammad Zareen. And then we've got the translation in English. So we've kind of done that to everything we've uncovered. So if you imagine the number of cassettes we've got, which is now 50, and we've done more than 100 interviews, what an extraordinary task that's been in sort of trying to
mind-boggling
to undertake all of that. So we have a team of 8 people working for us in Pakistan who are on this stuff. So they're basically transliterating. And what we've uncovered is there's a really interesting evolution of language that's pertinent to a language when it's just an oral-only language. It evolves quicker. Things become antiquated much quicker. It moves much quicker. So that's a really fascinating aspect of the language that we didn't
absolutely
that we didn't expect.
Right. So in order to answer to my question, Dr. Shakur.
Okay, so you are asking that why it is not well preserved, or why? Please rephrase it again on this context.
What I'm asking you is, first of all, is what do you think is the current state in terms of preserving the heritage languages within the second, third generation? Are we able to preserve it? Are our children or their children being able to maintain our heritage languages, or is it getting lost down the generations?
Okay, that loaded questions. And also, the reason is I cannot claim myself as a fully fledged linguist, but I've done 1-2 work, and from that basis, and from my long years of stay in England, if I may say. First of all, I'd like to thank Wajid for a good insight, and then he's looking back this aspect of language. But I quite like his category of language and class. I think that is a very important aspect, and also gender aspect as well. And if I may say, please watch a film called I for India, which is done by a doctor's daughter who is a filmmaker. Wonderful migration story where this doctor used to liaise with his relatives in India, in Agra, through videotape with 8mm films from the late 50s, 60s till up to 80s. And then you will see wonderful how the language is also translated in between and what is the uptake. Now, coming to the whether we are preserving well, I just feel, I'm trying not to be cynical, because in England there is I find, because that's the time I spend more, so I can't say for Britain, because Welsh and Irish are making a lot of interest, and they are doing their language heritage preservation far better than probably here. But within England, I find to some extent the language has been shifted, because there is a kind of homogeneity, as Wajid says, the second generation, if they're going to school and they spend most of the time in English, and then it's only in the probably 90s I found many of the children from Pakistan and India, and even from Bangladesh, are going to madrasas and temples. They're having their second languages or third languages as Arabic, not necessarily understanding. So, what I'm trying to say is, by spreading the butter thinly about the language and the aims, it is becoming, the currency is becoming lesser. Because of, for example, I was very strict. Myself and my late wife, we were very strict with my sons. They're in the 30s now, and they used to return back in English, and we always said, no, you have to speak in Bengali. And then I took the liberty of taking a case to one of the educational psychologists and she said, your children should learn 3 languages easily. So do press hard. I'm glad that I listened to her. Otherwise, we thought if we are trying to get them into two languages, they will be lost. But it's true that the uptake of my younger son, he's a GP here who speaks fluent Bengali, his uptake with the our language of Bengali was rather poor. But we did have the patience, so later he picked up. So the only problem is, some of the parents might be thinking that, okay, if they are studying English and if they bring an Hinko or other languages with them at home, whether that is going to diminish their uptake with the English language, which is, I would easily say, no, that's absolutely wrong. Rather, if you try to give it to more, that's better. So
Yeah.
the question what you're saying, whether they're preserving, I don't think we are preserving. But then I have to say, what is the norm? The reason is probably, I'm not saying, well, just got some money to get to go to this project, because these research projects, they cost money, time. And there is not in abundance to getting this money to do the. I've done most of my research free, because in the university I found these research projects, particularly in the 90s and in this next millennium, there's very little slice of cake for this kind of research. So if you're looking from even the ESRC funding with European funding, there's a little amount of money you will get. So I thought, well, I will do within my free time, and I got a lot of volunteers, like Numan Azmi's brother. He did a very good research with me, language maintenance and shift among Bangladeshi in Manchester, which he did in the 2010 or something. But where we found that by the language had been constantly being shifted, because I found some of the people of Bangladesh origin, because they came from East Pakistan, they were also having Urdu in their language. And so it is not what we call it a pure language anymore. So are the dialects. So my question is, are we going to get back to the original language which we came from? For example, Queen's English is not spoken in other places. We go to Liverpool, you go to Scouser, Geordie in Scotland, and in sort of in Newcastle. So what are we looking for? I think this we have to first one understand how far we can go back to keep preservation. And the other thing is, it is not only the language. Language is also with the culture. If you are culturally, for example, I know Numan and your wife, you're looking into the garments and the other fashion designs as well. So if you're wearing like the shirts I'm wearing, I've got one from Turkey, which I quite like. I'm wearing this one as like a fashion element, like integrity. Unfortunately, the culture here is very Western culture. All three of us, although we're into ethnic studies, but we're all wearing English, European dresses. We are not, he's not wearing any of the Kashmiri dress. I'm not a Bengali one. So that is also, I think, go hand in hand. If you're not really culturally, I was joking yesterday with Noman that after 20 years, I don't think we will see many fish grocers coming from Pakistan or Bangladesh and India, because my children, they don't eat as much fish as I do. And I used to have sort of salt fish, which my grandmother did in a village in Noakhali. I remember I was only 6-7 years old, and my grandmother lived for 100 years only with this salt fish and sort of a chili. And she was very happy to see me. My lip is getting red. And I still, I've still got in my deep fridge some of these fish, and I enjoyed it. But my son, he is not that interested. Now, my grandsons are hardly will be interested. So what sadly I'm going to see that after 20-30 years, these groceries of ethnic will be seeing the loss of these imported fish from South Asia. So that means end of fish eating. The interesting part, you talk about Sweden. I told my son that in Sweden, one of the nice breakfast is having herring fish with eggs, which I thought was a novelty, But you see, they have kept it. If you go to Sweden, you go to nice bread and breakfast places, they will give you that thing.
So I've been connected to Sweden for like more than 30 years. So like herring, like pickled herring and egg, I love it. I love that as a food. I really start down my street. So,
but can you think of anyone using it here? So same with here. We call that in our part we call pitha. I don't know what you call in Pakistan. They're really made of gur and wheat rice. Very working class of thing. They just mix together and fry it. Now that was our cake in the village, and it is very cultural thing to do this cake. But nowadays they all go to patisseries now, and by birthday no one would have as a pita, which became like a gur, which is like a sugar cane thing. So basically what I'm trying to say is, if you are just trying to have superficially, we can do a lot of sophisticated research, but coming to Noman's question, Number one, I don't see much of a demand from the ethnic people yet. That come on, we got to know. I mean, unless the only inspiration I get from the Welsh people, where, as you know, Welsh culture is very well developed now, and there's also discrimination if you don't speak Welsh language. Some of my colleagues were saying they couldn't work from England, they couldn't work in Wales because one of the mandatory things was that they know the Welsh languages as well. So, or I mean, so with the Celtic languages in Ireland. So, unless that kind of interest comes with us, but there'll be no job for this. Our children, when they will be releasing this, there'll be no job. So,
So
I'm
what
sorry.
you're saying is, what you're saying is that we cannot isolate language as an issue, as a separate issue. We have to link it up with our overall cultural practices. So when it comes to clothing, the food, the music, the whole thing, so it comes all as part of a package. So if we are to preserve our identity, our heritage in a different country, we should be encouraging or trying to encourage our future generations to preserve those culture as a holistic culture, not just an aspect of it, not just language, but the dresses or the food or the music, the whole thing. Because I remember my daughter, when she listens to South Asian songs, she doesn't understand the meaning, but she likes the tune. So she asked me, what does this mean? What does that mean? So I personally feel that Dr. Shakur, you made a very important point here. And that is that we must look at heritage preservation as a holistic approach, not just a segmented approach. So looking at our culture, which includes our language, the food we eat, the way we dress, the whole thing. Because when you talk about culture, there is a whole raft of other issues, like the way me and you, our generation, treated our elders, and our next generation treats our elders. There's a significant shift there. So the culture is a holistic thing. So what I'm getting from your answer is, we can't just look at language in isolation. We have to look at preservation of the culture as a whole. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, well, just to add into that, for example, when I was teaching at Sheffield University way back in the late 80s, and I was very busy at young academic trying to get my tenure and all that. But my wife was very kind to take my sons to one of the community schools where they were teaching Bengali songs and tabla, the tabla, which was song. Luckily, my two sons, they learned the tabla and the language there. And this, my son, is a Cambridge academic now. He's doing very high profile thing. But when he gets stressed, he plays tabla. But interestingly, now his son, who has got a lot of ample time going to private school, he's playing piano. So I said, well, when you play piano, why don't you do some of my Bengali songs? So because the hard-nosed grandfather, all right, Dada, let's try something with you. So what I'm saying is that I don't know about Wajid's son. Wajid has very rightly explained what my son is also having the problem about. Getting the third, fourth generation is getting even tougher. And all I'm saying that unless someone is really, really passionate and interested and get into cultural upbringing with we are all with the internet culture. We are not going to any family gatherings anymore as we were doing in the 80s. So you're all doing like a Zoom meeting here. And I think there's also limited experience there. But anyway, I don't want to give you a negative experience. All I'm saying is, while some career researchers will do on their own way, but the uptake with the subcultures that the ethnic here is, unless someone like a reformist come and go to the round and say, come over. I really love those people who in the 80s doing free classes for ethnic songs classes or languages.
Supplementary school.
I need almost free, to do Bengali language. But now they are, should we do that or do interneting? So internet cottaging has become far more important in their free time rather than doing that. But I don't know, what is your take to that? What I've told you,
Yes, what is your take on this particular aspect, Wajid?
Well, I think you're both very right with regards to how language can't be separated from culture, because language is fundamentally culture, right? And a language is just one of the expressions of that culture, right? And so I think you're right, and I think we all have sort of interests in what we consider to be valuable. Where are our values in the things that we, what do we admire? What do we want to pass on? there's an interesting thing about my son's. My son is essentially he's a sculpture for me. He's an experiment, right? I'm seeing him as a living sculpture, and seeing what happens, what kind of shapes he's turning into. He's 11, my son, right? And so, observing him and his language acquisition, and his morality, and how he forms the world is fascinating for me, right? Because in fact, it's at the nub of what culture is and at the nub of everything about language and music and expression and essentially a worldview, right? So we have, of course, an extraordinarily diverse way of perceiving the world. So what makes otherness, what makes something other, traditionally has been either ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or body, able-bodied, disabled-bodied, whatever. We now understand that actually that there's neurodiversity, right? So what constitutes neurodiversity is now another way of considering what might be the other. The contemporary takes of what is neurodiversity is usually kind of whether somebody is on the autism spectrum, really. But actually, before that, neurodiversity is, you can look at neurodiversity in actually slightly wider terms. So it's really quite interesting in terms of how different our brains really are. And so, so Isaac, my son's Isaac, he's a really interesting manifestation of this otherness to me, right? How he's dealing with, and I observe it, and I've observed it from when he was seconds old to now when he's, just about to start secondary school, right? So this thing of language being fundamentally culture is true. I entirely agree with that, and I think it comes with lots of other things. He doesn't play, he doesn't sing in knots. I don't sing knots. My dad did, and he was essentially, we have books on books of the stuff of the knots that he wrote, all the poetry that he wrote. We still have that. I don't sing them. Right? They're essentially not relayed to Isaac, and in fact, that's part of the reason why is that I agree with many of the moral codes, but I fundamentally disagree with many of it too. I have made that choice that basically I disagree with this, and this, and I don't think these are good values to carry on. These are my choices, right? And these are things that Isaac himself will also do. As much as I think I'm an excellent parent, I'm bloody not. Because he will, like in 10 years' time, say, you didn't do this for me, you didn't do that, whatever. That's expected too, right? So
but one of the only other interesting part I realized in my late age now, because you're all younger than me, but as you get older, the good part is, then you're no longer with the rat race anymore. You've got more time to buy things like those. This is like a puppet I bought from Bursa in Turkey, which is like an Ottoman Empire thing, like a snake charmer thing. Now, I bring this from my sons and grandson. Now they find this interesting. Well, oh, I didn't see any doll like that. This is snake charmer. Where is another way of popularizing is making it. This is why I like Tariq Mahmood, who wrote Patwari children's, which are more or less gone now. He writes in children's English, so it doesn't always have to be really get into the hardcore language, but as long as you get the essence of the culture in English, and that gives a currency. Otherwise, they will only know Baba Black Sheep, So if you get your children to write some of these poems and the song or from those part of the world, which I think is very, very interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, the thing for me is that Isaac is his ethnicity. He's British Pakistani mixed plus Swedish, right? So I mentioned to you, and so his kind of Swedish identity is equal to his South Asian sort of identity, and kind of what that means in terms of language and song and food tastes and everything. Like you mentioned before, that language is indelibly part of identity, right?
I think. So, sorry, but he's saying something. Sorry, carry on, Wajid. Carry on. Sorry.
No. So it's like I say, it's kind of really interesting in that I think for me, what's been interesting is relaying Patwari to him. He actually can't speak the thing. He doesn't understand my mom at all. And in fact, by us working on this particular project, what's interesting is the kind of, going back to the idea of class and socioeconomic sort of identity.
Very important one.
My mom, and in fact, the way I receive Urdu is always from a position of condescension. It's always like, to me, it's relayed to me as like, I'm the working class guy. You don't speak Urdu. Urdu is the lingua franca of the country. We have the power, and essentially we're going to relay that and remind you of what place you are. You are working class, and let's understand the class dynamics at play here. So by me actually making the point that Potwari is a language, not just some scummy dialect that you should be ashamed of, that you can introduce considerable pride in language, right? And so that's something that I can now relay to my mom, and she has now, strangely, after all that, she's 83, since we've started work on this project, that she has considerable more pride in the language that she speaks at home.
And this is a very important point you're making, because if I can just add to that, because only day before yesterday I was in Cambridge with my grandsons, and he was showing me some of the nicer history of pyramids. And there I find this new kind of a program which shows pyramids. We always, these big monuments were always were glorifying the top class, wasn't it? It was not work, but this program was showing how the slaves were being tortured, how they make it. And that makes me think, see, where 20, I wrote this book called Imagining South Asian Culture in English. So you can see the English airman sitting in front of Taj Mahal. So you might say Taj Mahal is, we can say, like a decoration for love. But if you also do the alternative story, who were the actually the craftsmen who came from Persia and Iran, and how many of their hands were cut as well,
Yes.
What I'm trying to say is, while we have got the advantage of living in this Western world, you also show the alternative story, that why this language did not move, and what was the spectrum from the working class and from the top class as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Basically, we're saying that more interest that way.
I think oral history as a discipline is the way into that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And you touched upon something as well.
Sorry?
I said you were going to say that you touched upon something very important earlier, which is when you said that it's my decision. So how you pass on your heritage, whether it's culture, whether it's language, whether it's food habits or whatever, how you pass it on. You said your dad did certain things, you decided not to do it, so it's your choice. That's the word you use, right?
Yeah.
What I'm taking from that is that the reason it's not passing on, or the way to make sure it does preserve, is the same thing, and that is parents. If the parents choose to maintain their cultural heritage, be it language, be it food, be it everything else, then parents can instill that ownership of that culture and pride in that culture in their children, and then that can carry on. If the parents do not, then it will gradually get lost. And I remember very clearly my eldest brother and his wife making sure that their children do not speak in any other language other than Bangla at home, and they would not respond to them unless they spoke in Bangla. Not only that, in Bangladesh, the culture is at home you wear what we call lungi, which is like a
sarong, sarong, really.
Sarong, yes.
Sarong,
it's something that the people in Malaysia and Burma, that they also wear.
South India.
Now in Bangladesh, that is what common practice is, and at home that was what you wear. Now my nephews, born and grown up in England, wear lungi at home. I don't, despite the fact that I grew up in Bangladesh, because I just didn't feel comfortable with it. So I don't. Neither does my children. But my nephews wear lungi because their parents insisted on maintaining that culture. So what I feel is that way to preserve the culture, and as Dr. Shakur mentioned, that you can't isolate language, the holistic approach, whether it's language, whether it's food, whether it's music, whatever it is. And I remember a lot of people saying, oh, I grew up listening to that music with my parents. So if your parents are playing a particular type of music, you get used to it, and you kind of have a fascination towards that kind of music, whatever it is, whether it could be Bollywood music or Dollywood music or Lollywood music, whatever it is, So I think that the parents are the key in terms of preservation and maintenance and continuation of this cultural heritage and the language. If the parents don't speak their language with their children, and one other thing I was talking to Dr. Shakur yesterday, is I work with a diverse community. I work in, I run several social enterprises, and one of the key focus is to help maximize the potential of the ethnic minority communities. And I come across a lot of people who aren't able to, the first generation, who aren't able to communicate in English, and they're having struggle with their children. And when I say, look, you have decided to live in this country, nobody forcing you to. So why didn't you learn the language of this country you're living in? Because it's not only going to be beneficial for you, you will be able to contribute best to the country. They said, how do I learn? I said, speak to your children. Well, I want my children to learn my language. I said, listen, language is a means of communication. Two people talking does not necessarily have to speak in the same language.
Noman, I just want to contribute to Wajid's, he's got a Swedish wife, he says, and nowadays you will find lots of people will have different kind of partners, Bangladeshi with Pakistani or Indian with
absolutely.
And that way, the new thing is knowing the father's language, because we generally say mother tongue, and we really negate the other person. So there's also saying father's tongue. So the children have to write both of them. So like you want to, and this is what the hybridity, the hybridity of culture is important. So don't worry if the children are having 2-3 languages, there's nothing wrong. All I can say, look at the picture behind me. Like you, I grew up as a hippie in Bangladesh in the 70s, and with that blue hair even now. Whereas my son and grandson, they are really reading the madrasa language very well. So things will evolve as long as you give them more diverse to make them more interesting. That is our job.
Absolutely. I mean, what I encourage is if a parent wants to learn English and wants their children to, so what I suggest to people is your children should speak in your language and you speak English. They both understand each other. You can communicate, but in that way, you both learn the language that you need to learn.
The final thing is about
the parents are the key.
I just wanted to ask Ajay, but how do you think that while we might be happy with ourselves, but it's still in a small group committee, how do we communicate with the host community? And one nice way is with the melas. Those of you who have been to melas, I love them, because last time I was in Mela in the early 21st century in Bradford, the camels came from Multan, and my sons were absolutely fascinated with this camel dance. Now, and not only that, also a lot of English people are also fascinated by that. So if you can also make it more, not than having samosa, that's the only thing we can get into our the chicken. You say the ethnic chicken is very good, but try to get these other things as well as a cultural icon, so that more people will be interested to this kind of culture.
This thing about the Longies, it's something quite interesting actually, because there's a photograph I have of my dad, my cousin, and my dad's older brother, right? And as part of the kind of some of the photographic series that we undertook on the Tail Letters project. And you can see my cousin, who's in that generation of my father, right? He's actually wearing jeans and a jacket, and there's some other photographs of him that were taken by these photographic studios that were built up for migrants that came in the 60s. Right. So these were basically Commonwealth studios, right? So photographic studios that were for all the people that came from the Commonwealth, that were made in the UK. And these guys were dressed very similar to each other, whether you're from the West Indies or whether you're from Sri Lanka or Pakistan or whatever. Very similar kind of setup. The lighting is the same, the poses are the same, the clothes are the same.
Top hat as well.
And it wasn't top hats. It was sharp kind of late 50s, early 60s suits, right?
Yeah.
And what happened is that these guys would have these photographs taken and then sent back home, and they would say, "Look how we are in the mother country," right? Remember, this is the colonial heart, right? Look at how we are, like how we're doing well, right? And so the photograph of my dad wearing a salwar kameez with my cousin sort of wearing this stuff is really interesting, because a salwar kameez it's not kind of appropriate for northern English weather, right? So it's not really made for it. So I'm kind of questioning is whether. Oh, sorry, Noman, do you want to?
I was just saying we have 1 minute left, because we have got another program will be starting in a minute or so. And if we don't conclude, we're going to be cut off, because it's the way the system works. So I just want to thank both Wajid and Dr. Shakur for giving an hour of your time this afternoon. and giving us your insight about this very fascinating and very important issue. We would obviously not leave it there. There will be further discussions. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm also involved with an organization called South Asian Language Center, which is looking at the South Asian language issues within the UK. And as you mentioned, the name Farah Nazir, Dr. Farah Nazir, who is one of the founders of South Asian Language Center. So we will be looking at this whole language dimension within the South Asian diaspora in the UK. And this is just the beginning. We are not going to, and this is an issue that we're going to come back time and time again, because it's very, very important for us to understand the importance of preserving our linguistic heritage for generations to come. One of the things that Dr. Shakur mentioned, we don't want that to happen. We don't want our culture, our language, our food. Although because of the curry houses, there are certain element of food is never going to go from Britain, but there are certain other elements that are likely to. And so we need to look at this issue time and time again and put emphasis on making sure that our children and their children understands our linguistic and cultural heritage, so they can be proud about it, but they can also, more importantly, as you mentioned, Wajid, about connecting with their elders. My son, the youngest son, could not speak to my mom because of the language barrier, although my elder children could. So it's an important issue. We need to look into it. But I want to thank both Dr. Taslim Shakur and as I understand it, Dr. Wajid Yassin. You don't use the doctor, but you got a PhD. You might not say it. So
can I just say that, can you please make sure that he's a PowerPoint presentation, which I would like to have, and I think many of your audience would like to have. So if that could be made public as well, I don't know whether Wajid is happy to do that.
Well, I will have that discussion with Wajid, and if he wants to, we'll find a way to do it.
Yeah, I definitely want it. That's looking very good.
Okay. All right. In that case, we will have that discussion with Wajid, and we will find a way to do it. But once again, thank you very much for both of you for your time and for your contribution. And I want to thank all of you who has joined us from via YouTube, via Facebook, and via Twitter. This event will be live on all these three social media platforms within immediately after this program finishes, so you can come back to it on all these three platforms and revisit and replay it if you want to listen to it again. Once again, thank you to everybody, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Noman. Thank you.
Assalamu
alaikum. Okay. Is there any way to talk to Wajid later?